Hi, I'm Austin, and this is Animal Quests. Today we're looking at 6 encounters where the warnings were clear, the danger was known, and someone ignored both. From a kayaker entering a forbidden channel on the Zambezi River to a travel blogger crossing a fence in South Africa. But first, we begin in Zimbabwe, where a travel influencer stepped out of a safari vehicle during a lion sighting, and the attack was over before anyone could react. On September 14, 2016, in Zimbabwe's Hwange region, 28-year-old travel creator Zinzi Okafor joined a guided safari drive across a private wildlife reserve. She wasn't a major influencer, her page had just under 9,000 followers, but her cinematic travel clips and close-up photography had started attracting small sponsorships and outdoor brands. Born in Lagos and raised between London and Dubai, she had spent years turning budget travel into content. People genuinely followed for the feeling of being there beside her. That morning, before the vehicles left camp, the safari guide gave the standard safety briefing used across reserves in southern Africa. No guest was to leave the vehicle during open-area wildlife encounters. It was a strict rule, built from years of incident history and predator behavior studies, not a suggestion for tourists. Roughly 2 hours into the drive, the group spotted a lion pride resting near a seasonal watering hole. 4 adult lionesses and 2 younger lions stretched across open grass about 90 feet from the track. The guide stopped at normal viewing distance. Visibility was clear, and Zinzi immediately began filming from inside the vehicle, leaning upward through the roof hatch to capture the pride against the landscape. Passengers later said the shift in her behavior happened slowly at first. She leaned farther out, then moved toward the side door while still recording. The guide told her to sit back down. She kept filming. Then she opened the door. The guide repeated the instruction immediately, but by then Zinzi had already stepped onto the ground. Witnesses said she walked several paces away from the vehicle, holding her camera low to frame the lions behind her from eye level. Lions do not react only to distance, they react to movement, posture, and behavior. A standing human approaching openly across the ground registers completely differently than passengers seated inside a safari vehicle. A lioness can cover 50 feet in less than 2 seconds during a charge, and attacks are usually aimed high, neck, shoulders, or head, to bring a target down immediately. One lioness had reportedly been staring at the vehicle from the moment it stopped. The instant Zinzi cleared the door and moved into the open, the lioness stood and charged. The guide fired a warning shot into the air, standard emergency protocol, but the animal did not stop. At nearly the same time, another lion moved toward the vehicle itself, preventing the guide from exiting without placing the remaining passengers at risk. Emergency calls were sent to reserve rangers immediately. Rangers reached the scene around 20 minutes later. By then, the pride had already moved off. Zinzi Okafor was pronounced dead near the vehicle. No other passengers were physically injured. Both the reserve's internal investigation and Zimbabwe wildlife authorities later concluded that the guide had followed protocol correctly at every stage. He gave the safety briefing, repeated the warning, used the deterrent shot, and protected the remaining guests. The decision to step out of the vehicle had been Zinzi's alone. And that's the detail that stays with a lot of guides afterward. Because sometimes every rule is followed perfectly right up until the one moment somebody decides the rules no longer apply to them. While the Hwange Reserve had claimed Zinzi Okafor on a clear September morning, the next encounter moves deeper into western Uganda, where a different kind of overconfidence, one built across 14 years of close-contact primate fieldwork, carried a researcher beyond the final marked boundary of a chimpanzee territory he'd already been warned not to enter alone. On July 21, 2014, near Kibale National Park in western Uganda, 34-year-old wildlife field operator Paavo Karkkainen entered a restricted forest valley alone before sunrise. Rangers had already warned staff the previous evening about an unusually aggressive adult male chimpanzee moving through the area after several recent charging incidents near the trail network. Paavo was not inexperienced. Originally from Tampere, Finland, he had spent more than a decade working wildlife expeditions across Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. By 2014, he had been stationed near Fort Portal for almost a year, assisting a primate behavior research project that monitored habituated chimpanzees inside protected forest sectors. Colleagues later described him as calm, capable, and increasingly confident around chimpanzees, confident enough that safety restrictions sometimes felt unnecessary to him. The evening before the incident, rangers specifically instructed research staff not to enter the Western Valley trails before daylight and not to approach chimp vocalizations without armed ranger accompaniment. A colleague later told investigators that Pavo acknowledged the warning and casually mentioned he would check the area himself before the rest of the team arrived. The next morning, he entered the forest alone. Chimpanzees are among the strongest primates on Earth relative to body size. Adult males can weigh over 130 pounds and possess explosive upper body strength far beyond that of an average human. But what makes close-range encounters dangerous is unpredictability. Agitated chimpanzees can move silently through dense vegetation before erupting into sudden violence at extremely short range. Their attacks are chaotic and fast, often involving repeated biting, grabbing, tearing, and blunt force strikes directed at the face, hands, or upper body. Scene reconstruction conducted by Ugandan wildlife authorities later placed Pavo nearly 3/4 of a mile beyond the marked trail boundary at around 5:40 a.m. before full daylight reached the forest floor. Broken vegetation, blood evidence, and disturbance patterns in the undergrowth indicated prolonged violent contact across several meters. Investigators believed Pavo encountered the chimpanzee at extremely close range due to the density of the vegetation and the limited visibility inside the valley corridor. I think this is the detail that changes the way people picture this story. Chimpanzees do not feel dangerous in the same way lions or crocodiles do. They look familiar, intelligent, almost understandable, but an agitated adult male chimpanzee moving through dense forest operates on pure territorial instinct. Once Pavo crossed into that valley alone before sunrise, he entered an environment where reaction time and visibility no longer belonged to him. Evidence recovered at the scene indicated the attack was sudden and overwhelming. Investigators concluded that Pavo sustained catastrophic injuries within minutes of first contact. By the time rangers reached the area later that morning after he was reported missing, the chimpanzee had already disappeared deeper into the forest. Pavo Karkanen was pronounced dead at the scene. The Wildlife Authority later conducted a formal review alongside the research organization overseeing the project. The death was categorized as a preventable field operations fatality. Internal rules required ranger accompaniment during heightened aggression incidents and prohibited solo movement into restricted sectors before daylight. Procedures investigators confirmed had not been followed. No criminal charges were filed, though the organization later revised its field policies to require mandatory radio confirmation before anyone entered active chimpanzee zones alone. What I keep returning to here is how experience can slowly reshape a person's sense of risk. Paavo had spent years around chimpanzees. He knew the sounds, the movement patterns, the warning displays. The rangers gave him the information, and he understood it well enough to repeat it back. Then he entered the valley alone anyway. That gap between hearing a warning and believing it truly applies to you, that's where this story actually ends. The forest closed around Paavo before sunrise, and by the time the rest of the team entered the valley, the chimpanzees were already gone. In the next encounter, what followed is a different hemisphere entirely, the Northern Territory of Australia, where a creek had been posting its own warning for years, and one visitor turned that warning into a social media caption. On March 7, 2017, near a remote creek access point in Australia's Northern Territory, 26-year-old Italian backpacker Breno Solferino entered crocodile-inhabited water after midnight, while 3 friends remained on the bank nearby. By that point, Breno had been traveling through Australia for almost 5 months. Originally from Verona, Italy, he had arrived the previous October on a standard working holiday visa and spent the following months moving through the East Coast backpacker route, hostels, temporary jobs, long bus rides, and shared travel groups that formed and disappeared every few weeks. He had worked briefly near Cairns before eventually making his way west into Darwin by early 2017. Like most travelers moving through the Northern Territory during wet season transition, Breno was following recommendations passed between backpackers: waterfalls, swimming spots, remote campsites, and creek systems outside the city. But early March in the territory carries a very specific kind of environmental risk. The wet season had begun easing into the dry transition period, which changes crocodile movement patterns across the region. During peak flooding months, saltwater crocodiles often spread far inland through swollen river systems and overflow channels. As water levels begin dropping again, many start moving back toward permanent waterways and coastal systems. Wildlife officers across the Northern Territory had already updated warning signs at multiple swimming and creek locations in the weeks leading up to March 2017 because crocodile movement becomes less predictable during this period. The creek access point Breno and the other backpackers reached that evening had active warning signage posted at the entrance. According to later statements given by the 3 surviving travelers, the signs were impossible to miss. Investigators would later confirm that Breno himself photographed one of the warnings shortly after arriving at the site. The group stayed there overnight. They built a small fire near the creek bank, drank, talked, and remained at the site after dark. By midnight, the surrounding area had become almost completely black, apart from the firelight and occasional flashlight beams. Northern Territory waterways at night operate differently than they do during the daytime. Visibility collapses, surface movement becomes difficult to track, and crocodiles hunt most effectively in exactly those conditions. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptilian predators on Earth. Mature males can exceed 16 feet in length and weigh over 1,000 pounds. Unlike predators that rely on pursuit, crocodiles function as ambush hunters. They remain nearly motionless beneath the surface, often with little or no visible disturbance in the water, waiting for movement at the shoreline or in shallow areas. When attacks occur, they happen extremely fast. The initial strike is designed to seize and destabilize the target immediately, usually followed by violent rotational rolling, intended to disorient and submerge. In documented nighttime attacks involving deep water, survival without immediate external intervention is extremely rare. Sometime after midnight, Breno entered the creek. The other 3 backpackers stayed near the campsite and watched from the bank. Later statements described a sudden disturbance in the water near where Breno had moved out from shore. One of the group reportedly shouted toward him. Another briefly scanned the water using a flashlight. Then the surface settled again. None of the 3 entered the creek. Instead, they backed away from the shoreline and contacted emergency services. The location's remoteness, combined with darkness and difficult terrain between the access point and the nearest roadway, made an immediate nighttime rescue impossible. Northern Territory Police and wildlife rangers did not reach the area until first light the following morning. When rangers arrived, they located a large saltwater crocodile still near the site. Wildlife officers assessed the animal's behavior as consistent with recent feeding activity. Under Northern Territory protocol involving fatal crocodile attacks, the crocodile was destroyed shortly afterward. Breno Solferino's remains were partially recovered from the surrounding area. The subsequent investigation conducted by Northern Territory Police and Parks Australia concluded that the warning infrastructure at the site had been visible, compliant, and functioning correctly. The review found no failure in signage placement or public safety procedure. Breno's death was formally classified as the result of voluntarily entering a posted crocodile habitat during nighttime hours. No criminal charges were filed. No major policy changes followed the incident, although the location was later included in a broader seasonal review of crocodile warning coverage across the territory. The part that stays with me in this story is not the crocodile itself. It's the photograph of the warning sign sitting on Breno's phone, because that image means the information reached him. He saw the sign. He stopped long enough to photograph it. He processed it enough to joke about it online. And then, hours later, he walked into the water anyway. I keep thinking about how often people survive risky decisions before the one time they don't. That's usually how this pattern forms. Small warnings become background noise because nothing bad happened the last time, or the time before that, until one night in early March, at a creek in the Northern Territory, when the margin finally closes. Australia's Northern Territory gave no second opportunity, and thousands of miles northwest, another kind of wilderness. The dense reserve forest of central India would show how quickly a professional's overreach can become permanent, with no witnesses close enough to intervene. On November 3, 2015, near the Pench Forest region of Madhya Pradesh, India, veteran wildlife photographer Prithvesh Dasgupta crossed into a restricted tiger corridor while tracking fresh paw prints through the early morning forest. Prithvesh was 47 years old and had spent nearly 2 decades photographing wildlife across India. Originally from Kolkata, he worked independently, building a reputation inside regional conservation circles for patience, technical precision, and a willingness to spend days waiting for a single usable frame. His photographs had appeared in environmental magazines, conservation campaigns, and wildlife publications both inside and outside India. He was not an amateur tourist wandering into the forest with a camera. He understood animal movement, terrain behavior, and reserve systems at a level most visitors never would, and that experience shaped the way he approached risk. By late 2015, Prithvesh had been working on a long-form photography project near the outer sections of the Pench landscape, a dense mix of teak forest, bamboo stands, dry firebreak corridors, and seasonal drainage channels, supporting one of central India's known Bengal tiger populations. He possessed legal permits allowing photography inside designated visitor and access zones around the reserve perimeter, but the section he entered on the morning of November 3rd was outside those permitted boundaries. He had hired a 22-year-old local assistant named Deepak to help carry secondary equipment and assist with navigation across the terrain. According to later interviews with forest officials, the pair had worked together without problems during the previous 2 days, staying within authorized areas and following standard reserve procedure. That changed shortly after sunrise on the third morning. Deepak later told investigators that Prithvesh noticed what appeared to be fresh tiger tracks cutting across a firebreak near the edge of the permitted zone during the first low light of dawn. The tracks looked recent. The impressions were still sharply defined in the dry soil. Under standard reserve protocol, photographers operating with permits were expected to log sightings like this with forest staff rather than follow them independently into unmanaged corridors. Prithvesh chose to follow them anyway. According to Deepak's statement, he verbally warned Prithvesh that the tracks were leading beyond the marked boundary line. Prithvesh acknowledged the concern, but continued moving deeper along the firebreak corridor with his camera equipment. The two men eventually crossed into a restricted forest section and continued roughly 400 yards beyond the permitted area, before slowing near a dense stand of teak and bamboo growing beside the trail. Pench's tiger landscape is built for concealment. Bengal tigers are solitary ambush predators that rely on terrain, vegetation, and silence rather than visible intimidation. Unlike lions, which may approach openly in groups, tigers often remain completely unseen until the moment physical contact begins. They use contour, cover, and wind direction to close distance without detection. Adult Bengal tigers in central India commonly weigh between 350 and 550 pounds. Their attacks are designed for immediate incapacitation. Initial contact is usually directed toward the neck, throat, or upper skull using crushing bite force capable of collapsing the airway or severing major blood vessels within seconds. And in dense bamboo terrain, visibility can disappear within a few feet. Deepak later told investigators that there was almost no warning. He reported hearing a short sound from inside the bamboo stand to their right, low enough that he initially could not identify it. When he turned toward the noise, the tiger was already on Prithvesh. He described the attack as sudden and nearly silent. There was no prolonged chase, no visible stalking movement through the corridor beforehand. 1 second, the forest was still. The next, the tiger had already crossed the distance from cover. Deepak ran immediately. In later interviews, he stated that he could still hear movement behind him for roughly 10 to 15 seconds as he fled down the firebreak toward the permitted zone boundary. Then the forest became completely quiet. He did not go back. Instead, he continued on foot until reaching the nearest forest guard post, where he reported the attack. A response team composed of forest officers and local personnel reached the location approximately 90 minutes later. Investigators later reconstructed the scene using equipment placement, disturbance patterns in the vegetation, and Deepak's account of the attack location. Prithvesh's primary camera equipment was recovered near the bamboo stand. Prithvesh Dasgupta himself was found a short distance away inside the restricted corridor. Investigators concluded from the scene evidence that death had occurred at or very near the point of initial contact. The tiger was gone by the time officials arrived. The subsequent review conducted by Madhya Pradesh forest authorities confirmed that Prithvesh had knowingly crossed beyond the limits of his photography permit and entered a restricted predator corridor without authorization. Deepak was interviewed multiple times during the inquiry and cleared of wrongdoing. Following the incident, the department issued renewed advisories regarding unauthorized movement into restricted forest sections and increased patrol presence along that particular firebreak system. No attempt was made to locate or destroy the tiger. Understanding forest policy, non-habituated tigers involved in attacks inside their established habitat are generally not classified as problem animals unless repeated abnormal behavior occurs. Officials determined the tiger had acted within normal territorial and predatory behavior patterns for the environment. And honestly, that's the part of this story that stays with me. Because Prithvesh absolutely understood what those restricted zone markers meant. He had spent almost 20 years working inside forest systems. He knew why permit lines existed. He knew exactly what kind of animal moved through those bamboo corridors before sunrise. But experience can slowly create its own kind of permission. The confidence that develops after years without incident can push someone farther into dangerous terrain than an inexperienced person would ever willingly go. And on that morning in Pench, the photograph Prithvesh wanted was just far enough beyond the boundary line that he decided to keep following the tracks. Central India's forest offered no recovery window, and the next encounter shifts the setting entirely. To the open grassland of East Africa, midday light, a guided group on foot, and a retired engineer from Atlanta who had 2 days of successful wildlife access behind him, and decided that made the third day negotiable. On February 19, 2018, in the Laikipia Plateau region of Kenya, 52-year-old retired engineer Kofi Asamoah Ntiri was killed during a guided on-foot safari after stepping away from his group during an active elephant encounter. Kofi was originally from Accra, Ghana, and had spent most of his professional life in Atlanta, USA, working as an engineer for 27 years before retiring at 50. Retirement for him was not meant to be a quiet phase. He had planned it in detail long before it arrived: travel, movement, structured exploration of places he had read about for decades. By early 2018, he had already traveled through Morocco, Peru, and Vietnam, documenting each trip in long messages and notes to his family that emphasized immersion over comfort. He did not want distance from the world, he wanted proximity to it. The Kenya safari had been the centerpiece of his plans. He had chosen a conservancy in the Laikipia region, a vast ecological landscape on the edge of the Great Rift Valley, known for its open grasslands, acacia woodland, and free-ranging elephant populations. The itinerary included both vehicle-based game viewing and a controlled walking excursion through a designated open grassland zone, accompanied by a licensed field guide. By the time the group entered the conservancy on February 17th, the guide had already noted something important about Kofi. He was comfortable in the environment, but that comfort was beginning to translate into movement decisions that edged closer to wildlife than standard walking protocol allowed. He photographed animals from the vehicle, asked detailed questions, and often lingered after briefings, trying to understand behavioral cues more deeply. On the morning of February 19th, the group set out on a guided walking safari through an approved foot route in open terrain. The guide leading the excursion had more than a decade of experience working in the Laikipia ecosystem, where elephant encounters are a known and carefully managed risk. Early in the walk, a lone adult elephant was observed approximately 300 yards away, moving across the open grassland. The guide immediately halted the group and issued clear instructions: remain still, remain quiet, and allow the animal to assess distance and direction. For a short period, the encounter remained stable. Then Kofi stepped forward. He raised his camera and took a few steps toward the elephant. The guide repeated the instruction to stop, this time more firmly. Kofi did not move back. Elephants are the largest land mammals on Earth. Adult males in East Africa can exceed 13,000 pounds and stand more than 11 feet at the shoulder. Despite their size, they are highly responsive and can shift behavior rapidly based on perceived threat levels. Guides distinguish between two key charge types. A mock charge involves display behavior, ear flaring, trunk movement, audible warning signals, and controlled deceleration before contact. A committed charge is fundamentally different. The ears lock back, the head lowers, the body aligns into forward momentum, and the animal commits fully to impact. At that point, an adult elephant can reach speeds of up to 25 miles per hour. At close range, that combination of mass and acceleration leaves almost no time for recovery once the charge begins. The guide recognized the shift immediately. He called for the group to break left toward a cluster of low acacia shrubs and instructed them to take cover. The rest of the group moved. Kofi remained facing the elephant, still holding his camera. According to the guide's later statement, submitted during the formal review process, the elephant transitioned into a committed charge within seconds. It closed the distance rapidly across open ground, with no further hesitation behavior. The impact occurred at high speed on first contact. Kofi was struck directly and incapacitated immediately in the field. The elephant did not pursue the remaining group members. Instead, it paused briefly near the point of contact before moving away across the grassland, consistent with documented post-charge behavior in territorial encounters. Emergency radio contact was made immediately by the guide. A response vehicle from the Conservancy reached the site approximately 35 minutes later. Kofi Asamoah Ntiri was pronounced dead at the scene. A formal review conducted by the Conservancy and wildlife authorities in the region concluded that the guide followed correct procedure at every stage, halting the group, issuing clear instructions, identifying the escalation in elephant behavior, directing the group to cover, and initiating emergency communication. No fault was assigned to the guide or the operational structure of the excursion. The incident was classified as resulting from a failure to follow direct field instruction during an active wildlife encounter. Following the review, the Conservancy updated its walking safari participation agreements to emphasize that guide commands in the field are mandatory and that non-compliance results in immediate removal from the activity. What stays with this case is not confusion about what happened, it's how clearly it unfolded. The guide saw the shift in the animal's behavior and reacted correctly. The group reacted correctly. The elephant reacted exactly as elephants do when a charge becomes committed. And Kofi, standing in that open grassland with a camera in his hand, made the only decision in that sequence that broke away from every other line of behavior in the field that morning. That single step forward changed everything that followed. Kenya's Open Conservancy had claimed Kofi Asamoah Ntiri in a matter of seconds under clear February skies, and today's final encounter brings the pattern to its most literal conclusion. A fence in South Africa, a leopard on one side of it, and a decision that removed the only thing standing between the two. On August 9, 2016, at a privately operated wildlife facility in Limpopo Province, South Africa, 31-year-old German travel blogger Raffaella Metzger crossed multiple restricted barriers surrounding a leopard enclosure in an attempt to photograph the animal from closer range. Raffaella had been running a small travel blog since her late 20s. Originally from Stuttgart, Germany, she supported herself through part-time remote administrative work while organizing much of her life around long-budget travel. Her content focused less on resorts or tourist landmarks, and more on experiences she described as unfiltered. Wildlife photography became a recurring part of her work, and over time, the distance between herself and the animals she photographed steadily narrowed. By mid-2016, she was traveling through South Africa on a loose backpacking route moving north from the Western Cape toward Limpopo. Through an online travel community, she connected with Peter, a 33-year-old South African familiar with the region, who recommended a lesser-known private wildlife property outside the province's primary tourism corridor. The facility operated under a mixed-use model common among some smaller private wildlife businesses at the time: guided wildlife walks, enclosed predator viewing areas, and supervised interaction sessions involving selected non-dangerous animals. It was not a major accredited zoo, nor a fully open safari reserve. Provincial investigators later described parts of the enclosure infrastructure as older designs built before newer spacing recommendations for apex predator facilities became more standardized. Leopards at the property were not part of any visitor interaction program. The enclosure section housing the leopards included a designated visitor path separated from the predator area by an outer deterrent fence, warning signage, and a marked no-entry zone. Beyond that stood the primary containment perimeter, a reinforced internal enclosure system designed to hold the animals themselves. Maintenance access gates along the primary perimeter were intended for staff use only and remained secured during normal operating hours. Raffaella and Peter arrived at the leopard viewing section late in the afternoon. According to Peter's later statement to provincial authorities, Raffaella initially photographed the leopard from the designated path without incident, but after several minutes, she became frustrated by the angles created by the outer barrier fencing. Peter stated that she moved off the marked path and approached the outer perimeter fence to try to get a cleaner, unobstructed frame of the animal. He told her to come back. She kept moving. Investigators later concluded that Raffaella climbed past the outer visitor barrier and entered the restricted maintenance corridor located between the public viewing boundary and the primary containment perimeter. Physical evidence suggested she then reached an improperly secured maintenance access point connected to the leopard enclosure itself, an access gate staff normally used during feeding and cleaning operations. That gate became the critical point in the entire investigation. Provincial findings later determined the maintenance gate had not latched fully after earlier staff activity that afternoon. The enclosure itself had not structurally failed, but the unsecured access point created a direct opening into the containment zone once Raffaella reached it. Leopards are among the most physically efficient predators in Africa relative to their size. Adult females commonly weigh between 80 and 100 pounds, but their muscle density, acceleration, and explosive striking ability allow them to overpower prey significantly larger than themselves. Unlike lions, which often rely on group behavior, leopards attack alone and at extremely close range. Their hunting profile depends on sudden acceleration, rapid control of the upper body, and immediate incapacitation through bites directed at the neck or skull. Even in captivity, habituation to caretakers does not remove these instincts. The leopard housed at the facility was a 7-year-old female that had lived on the property for 4 years. Facility records reviewed after the incident documented no previous aggression towards staff operating within normal feeding and maintenance routines. But behavioral familiarity applies only within recognized patterns. An unfamiliar person suddenly appearing inside the containment boundary outside established routines represents an entirely different stimulus. Peter later told investigators he realized something had gone wrong only after Raffaella disappeared beyond the vegetation line surrounding the maintenance corridor. Seconds later, he heard her scream. He stated that the leopard moved almost instantly. Facility staff reached the enclosure within minutes after Peter ran back toward the office buildings to raise the alarm. The leopard was successfully secured inside an isolation section of the enclosure system before emergency responders entered the containment area. Rafaela Metzger was recovered from inside the primary enclosure zone near the unsecured maintenance access gate. Emergency medical personnel arrived roughly 25 minutes after the initial alarm, but she was pronounced dead before reaching the receiving hospital. The Provincial Department of Nature Conservation conducted a formal investigation into both the facility and the enclosure design. Investigators concluded that Rafaela had deliberately crossed multiple restricted barriers and entered a staff-only containment area not accessible to the public. The primary enclosure structure itself had remained intact throughout the incident. However, the investigation also identified failures in secondary safety procedure, specifically involving the improperly secured maintenance gate and insufficient passive standoff distance between visitor-accessible areas and predator service corridors. The facility was temporarily suspended during the review process and later required to upgrade enclosure spacing, gate security systems, and perimeter separation measures before resuming operations. No action was taken against the leopard, and honestly, that part matters, because this story was never really about an animal escaping containment. The leopard behaved exactly like a leopard inside its own territory. The sequence only became fatal because Rafaela kept moving past every boundary designed to stop a human being from entering that territory in the first place. That's the detail I keep coming back to here. The barriers worked right up until the moment someone decided they no longer applied to them.